We're working on the Island Sunrise pattern, and after doing all the cutting instructions, you end up with 4 bags, and each bag is set up with these things in it. You have the background curved piece, you have 9 Unit S paper pieces, you have your Unit S templates for your sections 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, and then you have 4 sets of rectangles that will end up being sections 2, 4, 6, and 8. Now, the sections 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 have been stacked so the fabrics are right side up. But when you're placing them on the paper template, what we're actually doing is placing the wrong side of the fabric to the wrong side of the paper. So these are stacked right side up. So if I'm to flip them over, now I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric, and now it fits perfectly under that section, and the sew side is the same as the line 1 where you're going to sew it. So what I'm going to do is flip over all my sections, and I'm going to start from the bottom of the pile. And what I did to remind myself which section it is, on the back of each section, this is a section 1, I wrote section 1, and I wrote sew side on my piece. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but it's written on the back. So I'm going to just flip them all over, and we're going to sew from the bottom of the pile instead of the top of the pile. So after flipping all these over, I also have to flip my other ones over, because this is the contrasting fabric that is matching this orangey red one. So I'm just going to flip all these over too. So you're going to stack them numerically to do chain piecing, and you're going to start with the number 9 section on the bottom of the pile because it's the last one that you piece. So you have your number 9 section, that's the first one that goes down. And then you have your number 8, and your number 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and your number 1 section. So that's the order that you're going to put them on the pieces of paper. So I'm going to start setting up for chain piecing, and I'm going to get it ready with sections 1 and section 2 already put together, matched up with each other, and stuck to the paper. So I'm just going to put these aside for now. And I'm going to stack my 2 sections together by putting the section 1 with the wrong side up and the section 2 with the right side up, touching each other so the right sides are together. And I'm just kind of sort of center that on that piece. And then I'm going to place it behind my section 1 so that the raw edges are even with the dotted line next to line 1. And to make sure that matches easily, I can just fold the template on the line 1 dotted line. I'm going to fold the template down towards me, and my raw edges are going to line up against that. So I take my pieces that I just matched up together, and I make sure that the raw edges are even with that fold. And I want to make sure that the template 1 piece goes a little bit past the edge of the paper. And I'm going to grab them all together like that, and I'm going to put a pin in them to hold them all together so that they're ready to get sewn. And so now when I put it on my machine, I'm just going to sew on the dark line 1 solid line. So I'm going to put that aside, and I'm just going to stack all of them like that. And then I'll just pile each one on top of the other. And then I can sew all my line 1s at the same time. And so that's how I like to start my pattern. And then the rest of the process is the same as all her other patterns and the Judy Niemeyer process. So as I'm matching them up, I come across one of my wedges that had a little notch taken out of it, because when we put our little sample pieces on our pattern for reference, it ended up right where the template ended up cutting a notch. So not to worry, because when I lay down my template piece, my paper piece that I'm going to sew it to, I can see that inside these dark lines where section 1 is, I have fabric, so it doesn't matter. I also want to show you that it's good to do it on a flat table, because when you lay down your pieces together like that and you've got them centered, you can actually tell better where that dotted line is, and you can press with your finger and you can feel the edge of the fabric and you know that it's lined up right on the dotted line. And then when you go to put your pin in, you can hold the pattern with the paper with the fabric all together with your hand, and then you can pick up one edge and it doesn't move as you're putting your pin in, and that way the head of your pin is near you and you're going to start sewing up here so you can pull the pin as you go. So I'm happily chain piecing along here, almost done with the end of my pile. Check. I have this little featherweight machine set on 20 stitches per inch. It doesn't have the same kind of gauge that the modern machines have. Last one. Now what you need to do is cut them apart. So I just take them off the machine. I keep them in the order that they were in because my next pieces in line are all in the same order as well. So I just snip them and place them on a pile on top of each other. So stick the next one, put it on top. Stick the next one, put it on top. Until I have my pile all set up again. And then I go to the iron, and I'm going to iron them all open. And I'll iron the first one, put it down, iron the second one, put it on top, iron the next one, put it on top, and then they'll all be in the right order again. And then when I go to trim, I take the one off the top, I fold the paper, I trim with my 1/4 ruler, and then place it down. I do the next one, I place it on top of the first, I do the next one, I place it on top of the pile, and then I'm all set to start putting my next section, which would be section 3, on. And they'll be right back in the correct order. If you always keep in mind that you have to work through the pile, place them down, place the next one on top. So I iron them open. And I just place this off to the side. And I take the next one in the pile. I open it. Sometimes it helps to finger press it a little bit so you make sure that you don't have any creases there, that you're completely opened up. And it just goes on top of the last one. So I have my nicely pressed stack, and I'm going to start trimming them. So I just take the first one off the top of the stack, and I'm going to hold it so that I can read the front of the paper piece, and I can read the thing that says line 1, line 2, line 3. I sewed on line 1, so I'm going to place my template along the dark line 2, the solid line, and I'm going to have to tear a little bit of this away where you can see the stitching went over it. Sometimes it's good to do it before you place the template on there. Just a little pull will do you. And then you place your template, you fold it towards you, you put your 1/4 ruler on the fabric, and you butt it up against the template so that you can see through to the fabric. You don't want to place it on top of your template and cut, because then you'll cut away the seam allowance. So that's what the 1/4 is all about. It butts up right against your template. And then you can cut right along that ruler. And you've given yourself a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I open it up, I place it aside, I take the next one in the pile and I do the same thing. And I'm gonna trim all of them one at a time, making sure I can read line 2. First I gotta tear away those little bits right there. Just a little bit. Line 2, place it on line 2, fold it towards me, and then use my ruler and trim. I put it on top of the pile. That's it, until I'm all done with this pile. So I finished trimming all of my stack, and the next process is to take the next section and put it on the back. So we're on section 3. So that's the whole process. First you place the fabric, then you sew the fabric, then you press the fabric, and then you trim the fabric. And we're back to step 1. We're going to place the fabric. So the next section is my section 3, and I'm going to make sure that I'm looking at the one that's on the top of the pile, and in this case the one on the top of my section 3 is the right color. So it's going to line up so that the bigger part of the triangle is at the top of the wedge. It goes right there. So I know that when I sew it in, I'm going to put it right sides together, and it gets sewn along here, and I'm going to hold it at the top and the bottom, and I'm going to turn it over so I'm looking at line 2, and I'm going to bring it right to my machine, and I'm going to stitch it, and I'm going to do chain stitching. So each one I piece will stay on the machine until I'm ready to put the next one up. So I'm just going to chain stitch these together. And line 2 kind of ends sort of in the middle of the paper. It doesn't matter, just pull it away from your foot, get your next one, pick the next one off the pile, and make sure it's right sides together, and make sure it's off the paper a little bit. Hold it in place and put it right on your machine on line 2. So we're actually getting 2 steps done at the same time right now. We're placing and then we're sewing. Placing and sewing. Grabbing it, bringing it right to my machine. So when I'm done with the 18 of these, I'm going to bring them over to my iron. I'm going to open them all up, iron them. I'm going to bring them back to my table, go through the pile, trim them all, and then I'm on to section 4, which is another one of those rectangular pieces for the spikes. And you do the same thing. You're going to line up the raw edges with the edge that you just cut, and then you're going to pick it up, put it over to your machine, and you're going to stitch on line 3. So I finished another stack, I pressed them all open. It's time to go to the next line. So I can see I sewed line 1, I sewed line 2, so now I'm going to place my template on line 3. There's a little bit of stitching that has to come loose before I fold my template over, so I'm just going to lift up the paper, give it a little pull, and then I'm able to put my template on line 3. Fold the paper back. Put my add a quarter ruler on there. And trim. And I'm going to go through the stack again on line 3, and then I will be done with another set of steps. Place, sew, press, trim. So here they are, all trimmed, ready to go. We're going to place. So I'm going to just take the top one off the stack, and I'm going to look at the side that I'm going to be placing the piece on. I take the top rectangle off my stack, and I'm just going to place it so that when it's sewn and flipped, it covers the point on the end of the paper. And it doesn't matter so much at the top of the curve, because the piece we're covering is down in here. So it's going to fall past, And I'm just going to turn it over, bring it over to my machine, and stitch on line 3. And I will do this to all of them again. And I'm just going to chain piece them once more. Top one on the pile, take the thing off, match it so that it hangs past the point. Flip it and sew on line 3. So it's always the same. Place it, sew it, press it, trim it. So I have my stack. I sewed them all. I pressed them open. Then I trimmed them all by folding on line 4. I pulled a little bit away. I folded on line 4, used my add a quarter ruler, trimmed away the excess on all of them. So now it's time, after trim, to place our next piece, which is section 5. Right here, we're working on filling up section 5. And you're going to place it right sides together with the raw edges even along the seam that you just trimmed, and hold it and put it right up on the machine. This one kind of stops in the middle of the paper, that's okay. And so we're just going to go through them all again. It's all the same steps over and over again. And even though I'm repeating myself, I'm going to just tell you, you place it, you sew it, you press it, and you trim it. That's all it is, 4 simple steps. So these steps are all really easy, but sometimes you can make a mistake. When you pick it up to put it on your machine, the piece on the back might be flipped a little bit. And then when you stitch your line, you might actually stitch it into the seam by mistake. Or in my case, right here, when I picked up my piece, I actually picked up two pieces at the same time. So I have to take that out. So when you're paper piecing and you go to take out a mistake, you have to have some tape on hand. And all you do is tape the seam that you're about to rip, because you don't want the paper to fall apart on you. And you rip it from the back side. And then once you get the piece off, you're good to go, and you can continue to paper piece. I like to go in and pull it this way, and it'll pull a couple stitches at a time. So when you have your machine set on really small stitches, if they're set way too small, you can't even get your seam ripper in there. But if they're set too big, then your paper will be hard to remove when you're all done with the quilt. So you got to find the happy medium. And there's my piece. I can take the second one off. I only wanted one. Now I can just put it right back on where it needs to be. And my paper didn't rip because I taped it first. So a little piece of tape comes in handy. Now we're trimming line 5. So there's a little bit to pull away, like there is on every single line. I just pull it by hand, put my template on line 5, and I fold it towards me. Now, I'm going to show you something. If you don't have an add a quarter ruler to place along your template and hook in there, you can do this with a regular ruler too. You just have to look at your 1/4 inch mark and make sure your 1/4 inch mark is placed right along your fold. And then you can trim. So you don't have to have special rulers. They just make it a lot easier because that lip on the ruler makes it foolproof. You know, you can hook it right into your template. I just want to show you that. You don't have to have the add a quarter ruler, but it's very handy, and I would suggest using one. So we've pressed. Now we're back to the trimming, and then placing, sewing, pressing, trimming. Placing, sewing, pressing, trimming. Placing, sewing, pressing, trimming. It's pretty repetitive, but I'm almost done with this quilt. And I'll show it to you. I'll show you the pieces when I get to the next step. which would be placing the curves. Well, that's it. I finished piecing them all, and you can see they need to be trimmed. So what we do now is just trim off the 2 straight edges, and then by hand I'm going to trim that curve, and I'll show you how I do that. So I'm just going to take my ruler, and I can use the 1/4 ruler, but I'm just going to flip it, and I start with the 2 straight sides. And then when I go to do the curve, I like it with the smaller blade. I feel like I have more control, but you can actually do it with the 45 blade as well. This is the 28mm. And I just get the blade started, and I kind of push just straight away from me. And at the same time, I'm turning my piece. So I don't have to curve the blade as I go. I can cut straight. I have a little more control that way. And there it is. It's trimmed nicely. And so I've got to trim all of these before I attach them to the piece. But I'll show you how I attach it right now while I've got one done. So we know that it's going to have to go right sides together, and we know that we're going to sew this curve. The best way to do that is to hold it in place with a couple of pins. So the first thing I do is take the piece that doesn't have the paper on it, and I fold it in half, and I find the middle, and I just press it with the back of my fingernail and give it a little bit of a crease, so that when I open it back up I know exactly where the middle is. And then I do the same thing with the paper piece. I fold it in half, and I give it a good crease so I know exactly where the middle is. Now when I put that right sides together, my fold will lay down on top of my other fold exactly in the middle, and I can give it a pin. And I like to weave the pin a little bit so it doesn't twist. Now this end is going to have to get stitched like this along the curve, and when it comes up to the very end, you want it to be square. Like that. So I'm going to hold it in place with a pin, and I'm going to weave the pin. So I have these long flat-headed pins. They're good for weaving because they're narrow and they're long. And I put it in, and I come up, and I go in, and I come up a few times, as many times as I can. And that's going to stop the fabric from twisting in any way. And I have to do that on the other side as well. And I have to match that edge and keep it nice and square. And I don't want to get too close to the edge when I put this pin in, because this is the side I'm going to start sewing on. So I come down just a little ways, and I make sure I pin it so that the point is going to be towards the edge I'm sewing. It's towards the curved edge. So you're not pinning along the curve at all, except for in the middle there. You're pinning on the 2 straight sides, and you're pointing the pins towards the curve. So you're going to manipulate this piece as you go. So now when I start to sew, if I felt I needed a little extra pins, I could put some extra pins in, or I could use a fabric glue pen, and I could dab a couple glue spots there so it stays nice. But I find that I can just work it right through the machine. I kind of just hold it as I go, and I stitch along the curve. So I'll stitch one up to show you. And then I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to pin all the rest of these to their parts. And then I can chain piece them all, and they'll all be done. So I have my piece, and I'm going to start on the edge, and I'm going to keep the piece that doesn't have the paper on the top. And I want a 1/4 inch seam, so I have a 1/4 inch foot on here, a 1/4 inch quilting foot on here. So I'm just going to keep the edge of the fabric on the edge of the foot. And I'll take a couple stitches, and then I'm going to take that first pin out. And now I'm just going to move it along carefully. And this is when the purple thing comes in handy, because you can make sure you don't have any wrinkles as you go. So I'm just going to slowly manipulate this along. And I'm going to unfold it here and there and make sure it's flat. I keep my eye on the edge of that foot and the fabric, trying to keep it along the edge. I don't want any folds. I don't want to stitch over any folds. Looks like there might be one happening there. Let's get that out of there. When I get to the end, I might have a tiny bit of extra somewhere, and if that's the case, I'm just going to trim it off. Pull that pin out. And that's it. Let's see how it looks. When you open it out, there it is. Very nice. So it just needs to be ironed. And then before you put the whole quilt together, you can tear off all these papers. And the best way to tear off the papers is to start with the last section that you sewed on. So start with section 9, and they'll just come right off. And then section 8. See how easy that is? And section 7. And once you get all the papers off, you can put all of the center pieces of the quilt together before you add your borders. Fun. This is something you can recruit kids to do. They like to do this. Sometimes husbands like to do it too. Or if you're the guy doing the sewing, maybe your wife will want to tear these apart. It's a little therapeutic. It's almost like when you're popping bubble wrap. As long as your stitches were small enough. If they weren't small enough, the papers don't come off very easy. Voila! One done block. So I've already put these together, but I'm going to explain to you how I did it. When you put the first two together, you make sure when you sew that seam that you stop 1/4 of an inch before you get to the center, and you do a little back tack. And then when you put your second two together, again, you make sure when you sew this seam that you leave 1/4 of an inch unstitched near the center, so that when you go to sew the two sets together, and you've lined it up, and you've made sure that your seams line up in the middle, you'll stitch along, and when you get close to that center part, make sure that your seam here is pressed down, and on the bottom make sure that seam is pressed down. And when you get to the sew spot where that seam was, you stop and back tack a little bit, and you pull it away from your machine. And then you make sure that your seams are pressed up. Just finger press them up out of the way on the top and on the bottom. And then you'll be able to put your needle back in on that seam line 1/4 of an inch from the edge, back tack a little bit, and finish your seam. So that you don't have any of these floppy seams enclosed in anything. That way, when you flip it open, you can press your seams counterclockwise. This one will press this way, this one will press that way, that way, and that way. And in the center, what you end up with when you press it that way is 4 squares. It shows as 4 squares, and it's nice and flat, and you don't have any of those lumpy bumps in the middle of your square. And it doesn't matter if you have 4 wedges together or a different configuration where you have maybe 3 wedges together and then just solid fabric. Any way you look at it, they're all going to be pressed counterclockwise, and they're all going to end up with this little 4 square in the middle that presses nice and flat, and it'll keep lumpy seams out of your quilt. So I've got them all laid out. All my 4s are done. I've lettered them so that I won't put them out of order when I go to put the whole thing together. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. So now, when I go to put them together, I'm going to sew a row together, and then another row together, and another row together. And because I ironed these all in the same direction, I have opposing seams which will nest nicely. On this block it's pressed down, and on this block it's pressed up. And on this block it's pressed down, and this one it's pressed up. Same thing going in the other direction. This one's pressed this way, this one's pressed the other way. So on every one of these intersections where I have seams meeting each other, when I go to put the seams together, they're pressed in opposite directions, so they nest nicely. You can feel them like click right into each other before you go and you sew your seam. So that makes it much easier. After sewing the center together, my next step is to place the border squares or the square rectangular combination around my quilt. And I like to lay it out before I put the middle smaller border in, because I like to make sure that I don't have any pieces that are going to look funny next to something else. And I lay them all out on all 4 borders, and I sew my pieced borders together first so that I know I'm going to like the layout. So then I pull them aside, and I can sew on my pieces for my smaller inner border. Number 1 from 4 years ago, and here's the new one. 17 hours of fun to get to this point. Now I can quilt it. Hope you had fun quilting along with the Island Sunrise, and patterns are by Judy Niemeyer, and they're on quiltworks.com. You'll find the link in the description below. May your bobbins always be full. Keep on quilting.